Okay, so as my title explained, I'm here to talk about mashup culture. I had some interesting conversations today at lunch, and I asked people, do you know what a mashup is? It's one of the things I'm going to be talking about today. And they described things that I had never heard about before. So I'm starting to understand that the term has a variety of different meanings. But today I'm going to be talking about audio mashups. I start with this track by The Verve. This is not what I would call a mashup, sort of a funny way to start, but this is what I would call an example of audio sampling, a particularly notorious example of audio sampling. So many of you may have heard this track before. It's quite famous. It was an international hit from around 1997. And the story behind this track is that The Verve, in creating this piece, they sampled a piece of a Rolling Stones song. And by sampled, what I mean is they took a small snippet of audio, actually not even from a Rolling Stones recording. The song was called The Last Time, and the song was covered in 1966 by a group called the Andrew Oldham Orchestra. And The Verve sampled that recording, that string section that you hear at the beginning that repeats throughout the song is a sample from the Andrew Oldham Orchestra recording. And what's notable about this story is that even though The Verve negotiated a provisional contract to use that piece of sound with the Rolling Stones, when they put the track out there and became an international hit, the Rolling Stones lawyers got in touch with The Verve and said, you know what, we think that you used too much of that sample, and we want 100% of the royalties from that song. And this is a court case that they ultimately won, if you can believe it. So The Verve lost all of the money that they would have made from that song. It went into Mick Jagger and Keith Richards' pockets. And ultimately, the songwriting credits actually went to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards. And then they licensed the song to a Nike commercial and raked in a bunch more cash off of that. So, bittersweet moment for the Verve. And a lesson to all of us. Now, when that track came out in 1997, I was taking a break from graduate studies. Beyond teaching at Concordia here, I'm also a DJ and sample-based producer, and it was in around 1996, 1997 that I got started with that practice. And I'd played guitar and harmonica and other things before, done some singing, songwriting kind of stuff, but I was really interested in trying to figure out what was going on with the new music that I was so passionate about. Hip-hop, trip-hop, groups like Portishead, Tricky, Massive Attack, Tribe Called Quest, and others. What were they doing? How were they making their music? And I'd heard about this concept of sampling. So I went to the Steve's Music in downtown Toronto, sold off my electric guitar, and brought a sampler home, and opened up the guidebook and tried to figure out how to make this thing work, how to do what I wanted to do. And what I understood is that I needed to start developing a record collection that I could be taking sounds from and reusing and juxtaposing and putting into different combinations. And I started to make my own tracks and share them with my friends and that kind of thing. And then I heard about this case with The Verve, and I thought, oh man, so you're telling me that this is not only that this is an illegal activity, right? And I'm somebody who likes to abide by the law. I jaywalk and things like that. Other stuff I won't talk about. But the type of person that I am, I like to be law-abiding. And I was realizing what I was doing in my own bedroom was completely illegal. And potentially, if I were to try to make money from it or make a career from it, that I could be sued. I could be, sued out of the business. So I decided to go back into academia and get my PhD and have a day job where I could talk about sampling. You know what they say, those who can't do teach, right? And so that's, I guess, kind of the strategy that I ended up taking. But in order to keep relevant in the communication studies department, I do have an ongoing practice of music making and sample-based music making, ultimately. I was shocked by this next track when I heard it, and this is from 2009, and this is what I would call a mashup. And many of you have probably heard this track before.
I know you want pop, you want rock and roll.
You want it.
This year's remix
Got some phonics.
soul. I got pop, I got
Fucking electronic.
beats. I got hip hop music with the future flow.
So don't worry, even if the sky is falling down.
So this is called United State of Pop, Blame It on the Pop. It's from it was released in 2010, based on samples from songs from 2009. This is by DJ Earworm. Many of you may have heard of him. This is how many people have heard this track before, just to get a sense? All right, about half of the audience, if not a little bit more. Very, very famous track. It's done the rounds of the internet. Last I checked, there were over 10 million hits on YouTube, but that was back in the fall. I'm sure it's probably double that now. Very, very famous mashup. It integrates the top 25 Billboard chart hits from 2009. So artists like Beyonce, Miley Cyrus, if you can believe it, and the Black Eyed Peas, obviously, their track "I Got a Feeling" is the foundation for this track, on top of which DJ Earworm has linked an intricate series of different pieces of vocal snippets that he's put together into a new form, a new really catchy track, and a track that I think ultimately celebrates the artistry of those top 25 musicians that he chose. So what is a mashup? And I take this definition from an academic article. In its most basic form, a mashup is simply two samples from different songs blended together to create a new track. This typically entails capturing one track's instrumental or rhythm section and fusing it with another track's vocals. So I'm going to talk about some terms like instrumental track, a cappella track, just so that I don't leave you in the dust. An a cappella is basically a version of a song without any of the instrumentation. It's just the vocal element. There are ways that one can take a fully fledged track, like I Got a Feeling by the Black Eyed Peas, and extract the vocals. There are studio tricks that you can use to make what are called DIY a cappellas, and these are really important building blocks for mashup artists, along with instrumental versions of tracks. Here's an example of another mashup.
Kelly, can you handle this? Michelle, can you handle this? Beyonce, can you handle this? I don't think they can handle this.
So the source material is probably obvious to many of you. It's Bootylicious by Destiny's Child, and then Smells Like Teen Spirit. I wrote Nirvana versus Destiny's Child. The actual title for this mashup is rather crass. It goes by Smells Like Teen Booty. It's not me. And I didn't want to have it pasted back there the whole time that I was talking anyway. If you're looking for it, that's what it's called. By Too Many DJs. These are one of the earlier mashup groups. It's a DJ duo. And this was released in about 2001, which in my mind is kind of the beginning of mashup culture. And what I want to explain today is how mashup really grew out of trends that I think were important parts of the sample-based music that I loved and ultimately came to study and continue to make. But it's distinct in a couple of different ways. One thing that's really important to note is that most mashup artists release their material free online for downloading. And nowadays, people are pretty public about it. DJ Earworm has a website where all of his mashups since 2007. He's been doing that top 25 thing since about 2007. You can download them off of his website. Other artists like Girl Talk, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, have websites where you can download entire albums worth of mashups where he samples almost 300 different artists in ways that are totally obvious. You know, it's totally obvious where this material is coming from. And yet these artists aren't getting sued. The Verve got sued, they're not. What's going on? Well, one big and important thing is that these mashup artists are not making any money off of their mashes. They're putting them out there freely available. They're developing a notoriety or a celebrity, which they're capitalizing on when they do DJ gigs and they get well paid. DJ Earworm is being sought after around the world. He's now being commissioned to mash up works by Annie Lennox and Justin Bieber and everybody else, and he's getting well paid to do that. So he's making a living now by being a mashup artist, but he's not making a living by selling his mashes. And I think that's a really important distinction from the sample-based culture that came before. So, as I mentioned, there are two really important elements for any mashup. You need at least one a cappella and an instrumental, and they should be coming from different sources. So in the case of Smells Like Teen Booty, we have Destiny's Child, where the rhythm track has been removed and you have just the vocals layered over top of an instrumental version of Smells Like Teen Spirit, which Too Many DJs put together themselves by cutting and sequencing the various instrumental elements of the track into a long sequence and then layering Bootylicious over top of it, speeding up the Bootylicious track to make it match the tempo of the Smells Like Teen Spirit track. That's a fairly simple mashup. What DJ Earworm did and what Girl Talk do and many others are doing is much more complicated, and I think this is part of the evolution of mashup culture. And what you have now are many different snippets of a cappellas that are being strung together on top of different layers of instrumentals that are being sampled and also sequenced together, and new elements that are being added, like new beats that are being made, random sound effects, that kind of thing. And this is sort of the modern standard for a mashup. And I think it's what, in a way, demonstrates the artistry of mashup culture, how it's continuing to push and evolve. And it also brings us back to sample-based culture, because one of the things that happened after stories like The Verve losing all their money, MC Hammer ran into some trouble, as many of you probably know, when he sampled Rick James' Super Freak and didn't get permission to do that and ultimately had to share a Grammy Award with Rick James and pay him off a lot of money. These stories were getting out there, so sample-based artists were becoming more and more nervous about sampling from pieces in ways that were really obvious, even though they might have wanted to, because ultimately I think sampling is the greatest form of paying homage to an artist that you like, whether it's James Brown or whomever, Aretha Franklin or whatever. All of these artists that have been sampled time and time again. It's because we love the music that we want to work with it. And this is why I'm here today, because I think that the message that I want to deliver, and I'll come back to this, is that we shouldn't be afraid to mess with this media. It's out there, it's surrounding us all the time, and it's almost incumbent upon us to engage with it and to remix it and to put it out there, because that's what's going to push these art forms forward. I'll come back to this in a minute. One story that's really important that I mentioned and I didn't mention is the story of the Grey Album. You've probably heard of the Grey Album. I'll mention it really briefly. This is another watershed moment in the history of mashup culture, in part because it's where this litigation and this freedom kind of came head to head. So DJ Danger Mouse takes the Beatles' White Album, constructs a whole bunch of really unbelievable hip-hop beats, and then he layers a cappella versions of Jay-Z's Black Album. Jay-Z released those a cappellas, knowing that DJs would take them up and mess with them, and it would increase his celebrity, and put out the Grey Album. Many of you have heard of this. This was about 2004. It was a big success. It was circulating on the internet. He wasn't making money from it. And then EMI, the Beatles record label, contacted him and sent him a cease and desist letter and said, you have to stop this. You can't distribute this anymore. And this led to what was known as Grey Tuesday, which is February 24th, 2004, where a group called Downhill Battle took up the cause of the Grey Album and got 200 websites to host a copy of the Grey Album and promote it, and told everybody to download it on this day and distribute it as widely as you can. So this great act of resistance. And ultimately now, if you go and type Grey Album into a search engine, you're going to be able to find many, many copies of it. It wasn't hid under the carpet. It's now become a big part of popular culture, and it's a fantastic piece of work. And what's a funny anecdote from that is that ultimately in 2005, DJ Danger Mouse was working with a group called Gorillaz, and they were up for a Grammy nomination, and Gorillaz had put out the album that they were up for a Grammy nomination. They'd put it out through a label that was a subsidiary of EMI. So EMI was quite excited about this Grammy nomination that ultimately came from somebody who they had chastised before. Why do I put this up here? Because what's going to happen? Where is this going to go into the future? There's another thing that I haven't gotten to yet about mashups, which is a really important part of the culture, and again, what distinguishes it from sample-based culture. As I said, sample-based artists got used to hiding carefully where their source material was coming from because they didn't want to get caught, they didn't want to get sued, they didn't want to be like the Verve. Bill C-32, many of you have probably heard of this. This is, I think, it's interesting. It's objectionable in a lot of ways. I'm not a big fan of the conservative government. I'll put that right out there. But on the other hand, there's some really interesting parts of this bill. This bill is called the Copyright Modernization Act. This is a Canadian initiative, and it's trying to bring our Copyright Act up to speed with new digital technologies that are widely used today. So there's specific provisions against file sharing, against the kind of downloading BitTorrent stuff that I'm sure we're all well practiced at, including myself. But there's also a provision under the fair dealing element of the Copyright Act which says that it's actually all right to make a mashup, to use other works, and they don't even specify audio. This could be video mashups or images or whatnot. You can use these works, you can put them together, you can publish them online, you can distribute them as long as you don't make any money from it, and as long as you say what all your sources were. And that, in a legal term, is called attribution. And I think this is something that mashup artists have already been doing. It's either totally obvious where the stuff is coming from because they leave it as obvious, kind of like with the Too Many DJs example, or like DJ Earworm or Girl Talk will give long lists of all the different samples that they're using. So you can go back and find that source material. In a way, it's kind of like writing a paper at the university where you're copying and pasting quotations from other thinkers, and so long as you say where that material came from, it's legitimate and it's all right. And so I think that Canada is spearheading the way a little bit in terms of making this type of thing legal. Now, it's not legal yet. So strictly, mashups are not a legal initiative, but hopefully with some changes, Bill C-32 will go through. So my take-home message today is, and I'm going to do a little demonstration in a second, and I'm going to do a little bit of audience participation. But the take-home message here is, don't be afraid if you're a music producer of people mashing up your stuff. If anything, like I said, it's the ultimate form of paying respect. And it's a form of, it can be a form of critique, but it can also, it's a real form of celebration. New music will equal new mashups, because we're going to take it up and we're going to work with it. And I think one of the really interesting things about mashup culture is it's quite a do-it-yourself culture as well. And it's not just celebrity DJs that are doing it now. There's innumerable bedroom DJs. Type in mashup into YouTube, and you'll see so many different people who've decided to just take a stab at it. You know, I like these songs. I wonder what they'd sound like if I put them together. And I encourage you all to do it too. The software is easily available, freely available in many cases. So new music equals new mashups, which then promote new practices, new ways of making music, new ways of sampling, new techniques, which then ultimately lead to new music. And so it increases society's, I guess, richness, ultimately, right? This is an evolution of sample-based music, so we shouldn't forget that. We should think about the roots of sampling that come out of hip-hop and other forms. But it also is different because of this attribution notion, which I think is really important. And also, people aren't making money necessarily off selling their mashups. They're finding other ways to make money. And this is something that any musician is going to have to deal with today in terms of the way that music is being distributed and bought and sold or not. So now is when I'm going to turn to the audience participation moment, and Nomadic Massive warmed you guys up really well, which I'm quite psyched about. What I'm going to do is I've made a mashup over the course of this last week that I made for this TED event because I wanted to demonstrate some stuff. It's nothing really politically involved in the mashup. I'm not trying to make a point with it. It's just some good music that I've been hearing on pop radio lately that I particularly like and I thought could go well together. But I wanted there to be an audience participation moment. And so what I'm going to get you all to do is help me to build a new beat on top of which I'm then going to layer the mashup that I've already prepared in my studio at home. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to make 3 sounds together, right? The sounds are going to be, the first sound is going to be that, the second sound is going to be that, and the third sound is going to be, imagine you're in a quiet room and you're trying to get someone's attention, but you're not allowed to talk too loud, so you go psst, psst. That's the kind of sound, those are the sounds that I'm looking for, all right? The first sound I'm going to use it as a kick drum, the second is going to be the snare drum sound, and the last sound is going to be the hi-hat sound. So on the count of 3, what I'm going to ask you all to do is to stomp your foot together once, all right? And I'll get my unit ready here. And I think I should probably stand back at this point because it might be kind of loud. Okay, we ready? 1, 2, 3. Ah, perfect, perfect. So I'll just quickly edit that up. Very nice. All right, that's great. Save that. Okay. Now the second sound I need is that clapping sound, all right? So everybody's going to, on the count of 3, 1, 2, 3, you're going to clap your hands all together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Ooh. Ooh. Fantastic. Some talented folks here. All right. Oh, man, that's awesome. All right. Save that. Okay, now, so you're scolding a small child, or you're trying to get somebody's attention. All right? Ready? 1, 2, 3. I had no idea if this would work or not, and I tried it out last night in the rehearsal with about 5 people in the audience, and it was quite a different effect. All right, there we go. I think that ought to do it. Save that. Okay, so I'll get this started, and if you feel inclined to clap along or dance or do whatever, I'm going to be grooving up here, so we'll all have some fun. First thing I have to do is build the beat. That's it for me. Thank you very much.